Hi folks, we're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about President Trump's it's a shoot from the hip proposal, and I think it's just he said it to get the conversation started. But a 50-year mortgage, a home loan, and would this even in a small way, let alone meaningful way, address the issue of skyrocketing house prices, residential real estate prices? In the overall scheme of things, I don't think it will. But again, assuming that what the president was doing was just trying to kick off the conversation. Now, it's easy to confuse accessibility with affordability. I mean, you could stretch out a mortgage to 50 years, 60 years, or something, and say, well, that makes, because then the monthly repayments sort of fall, but only temporarily, because then more people can come in and afford to buy property, and then therefore the price then increases in the overall loop. But would it help if a mortgage was 50 years? Well, assuming you started young enough, which itself is an issue. If you look at most kids today, or most younger people, they go to college, study bullshit courses, and then they come out with a lot of student loans, and they can be in their mid-30s before they pay off those loans. Then they start saving up for to buy a house, or maybe have a family, something like that. So the idea that they would be granted a 50-year mortgage when they may only be starting on the property ladder in their late 30s is a bit of a stretch. That's hard to imagine. So in order for a 50-year mortgage to be workable, then they would have to be really taking on the loan to buy the property when they were sort of 19, 20 years old to make that work, maybe early 20s, something. So the practicality issue comes across, and would ultimately defeat the purpose. Similarly, with people, okay, I'm not going to go to college because I can't be making money, so I'll go out and get a job, and that means they then have an income, which means they can then get the mortgage. So unless loan standards, the banks and the financial institutions, unless they reduce the standards for getting a loan, such as does someone have enough income? Do they have any collateral to put on the table? How much deposit? If they're putting the tiniest, most minimal deposit down, and they're only, they're struggling sort of hand to mouth to pay the mortgage, and they've got a 50-year stretch ahead of them, you've got to wonder about the viability of those sorts of transactions. Let's look at why housing is unaffordable. Well, mass migration is a big part of it. Also, offshore buying is a big part of it. Masses of students, there's close to 1 million students a year coming into Australia, many of them from wealthy Chinese and Brahmin families, and they're all allowed to buy property. Some of them are buying 4, 5, 6 properties each. And there are some suburbs in Australia where offshore Chinese investors own 200 plus freestanding houses and apartments in the area. There are smaller beachside suburbs where over half the property is owned by Chinese property investors. Then you add in the amount of investment coming from the bigger BlackRock type funds and so on, and the offshore buying is huge. Some of the migrants coming to Australia, whether it's on a short-term work visa, a lot of them are allowed to buy property, and so they're not coming to work or to study necessarily. They're just coming to be front men, token people to front for the financial institutions back in India or China, and they buy vast numbers. So it's not unusual in Australia to find an illiterate, part-time, toilet cleaner from China who's got a property portfolio of $20 million because they're fronting for their nominees for the folks with the money. There's very little attempt to clamp down on that. So there's a whole lot of added demand into the property buying situation that didn't exist previously before mass migration and before mass offshore buying. So when I was going to property auctions as a young man, there'd be only local people, only local white people. Everyone's talking English and an Australian accent. There's no brown people at all. It's now that often in the more the auction, as I remember it, at least the auction struggled to even hit the price, and then the person selling the property had to accept that that's the best they're going to get. And the auctioneer and the real estate people tell them, look, you're not going to get any more than $100. This is about as good as it's going to get. We recommend that you accept it. And so that was how the auctions worked. Now, fast forward to the early 2000s when I first noticed this, going to an auction around, this is the inner city suburbs of Sydney. You'd be lucky if there's one or two white people, and they had to work their 9-to-5 job, and there's mum, dad, and the kids there, and they had a tight budget to work with, and say the property was supposed to sell for I'll use the round numbers, $100. Well, maybe the local people with their 9-to-5 jobs could go to $101, $102 or went that far, but after that they dropped out. They weren't. Now that used to be how everybody was at the auctions when I was a young guy. But then those people were gone and were replaced by cashed up international people or international financial companies, big ticket financial companies, and they were the players buying up the property. So it was no longer a game for people buying a home to live in. It had become an investment asset. Now, some of this was due to the unusually low interest rates that were in play. I'd never seen them that low. That stayed in place for quite a long time. I was surprised. Now, they called it quantitative easing, but it created an artificial inflation in areas. The problem of inflation was just moved around. It wasn't solved. It was just moved around. So instead of things like wage inflation and those sorts of things, there was property inflation. And because there was almost no interest being paid on, say, deposits in a bank, people who had money then looked at other asset classes to try and get a return. And property was an obvious one. Share market was another. And both property and the share market became mega overvalued as money moved into it. And then the people that have that sort of money, they have the ability to control the market in effect. So it no longer becomes a market. It's just a controlled money laundering machine, which is what real estate became in the West or any countries where mass migration was an issue. So that's why property is so expensive, or the primary reason. Now, people's purchasing power has declined. So in Australia, at least, that the proportion of people that can afford to buy property, even average price property, by the way, the people that can afford to buy property, that number is now very small. There's a handful of people that can afford to buy even average price property. All the buyers are from overseas now, or nominees of overseas buyers. Until that's dealt with or taken away, then the property prices going out of control will continue. And property flipping, and I'll come back to that in a minute, is of course a huge issue. Someone, there were guys say in the late 90s who bought a property for $1 million, and a few years later they can sell it for $2 million, and make a quick, tidy return. So property flipping's a big issue, but shows that it's homes that were for people to live in became just another asset or investment class that was being exploited fully for the profits that it could yield in a controlled money laundering environment, not a natural environment, not an environment where the purchasing power of the local people determined the price of the property. It wasn't the international buying capacity of international buyers what was now determining the price of property, residential property. So, and it's different if it's sort of business property or office space. But residential property is that's where people buy places for them, to live in and to bring up their families and so on. And I believe it should have stayed there. How do we bring it back to that? Well, the mass migration and not allowing people to buy property as investments, as an investment class, that's it, or taxing and penalising them heavily is another method. But coming back now to the issue of the 50-year mortgage, I'm not going to fixate on the 50 years. As again, I think the president was just creating a, let's start talking about it type thing. I don't think that'll actually fix anything. So more people can now afford a mortgage and come in to the buying property, so that if anything exacerbates things, unless again the mass migration, the offshore buying is dealt with. Half of Manhattan is owned by Chinese investors, for fuck's sake. So that definitely needs to be dealt with. When the mass migrants, if they're going to ever be expelled from the United States in large enough numbers, that will create a downward pressure on real estate prices as well. If the superannuation, retirement pension type companies are prevented from buying residential real estate, that too will have a downward pressure on residential real estate, and that's all a good thing. But again, coming back and focusing on the 50-year mortgage, I believe strongly in intergenerational mortgages, that the family can, someone can take a mortgage out and they can then transfer that mortgage onto their children or other relatives. Might be a younger brother or sister, or I don't know, a fucking cousin or a niece or a nephew or something. But keep it in the family, or at least be able to sell the mortgage on, but not sell the house. So in the case of accrued equity, there needs to be some sort of formula that the price of your house can only increase by 1% a year or something like that. So the idea is that because real estate can be flipped so quickly and readily, it contributes to the churn of price increase. Whereas if you're on selling the mortgage or transferring the mortgage, then you're not reselling the house, you're transferring the mortgage. What creates house prices is that the same house, it's only built once, but it can be sold 100 times. And it's staggering to look at a house that in the early 1960s cost $4,000. And today costs $2 million, $3 million, that sort of thing. That just illustrates the extent to which price inflation of homes, residential homes, plays an issue. So I don't think the 50-year mortgage would solve anything. Just because it gives greater accessibility doesn't mean it creates affordability, and the two are different things. So I would suggest that if we're going to look at house prices, firstly, residential home prices, they cannot be used as an asset class. And intergenerational mortgages, you can on-sell or transfer your mortgage, and that, I think, is the way to create affordable housing. You've been with Tassos today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.
So Perry Potter says